Hello everyone, my name is Gavin Mounsey. If you aren't familiar with my work, I'm an author, seed saver, and regenerative garden designer. The focus of my talk and presentation today is going to be creating biocultural refugia, planting the seeds of ancient wisdom within the fertile soils of modern regenerative knowledge. Over the past year, in the process of doing research for writing my next book, which will have a central theme of food forest design, I've been studying the forest ecology and ancient regenerative agroforestry practices of cultures here in Ontario. Now, what I found is here in Essex County where we live, 99.9% of the primary forest has been chopped down in the last 200 years. So that led me to ask the question, well, how was it that the cultures that lived here were able to provide all the food that they needed for themselves without destroying the forest over multiple millennia? Prior to the global proliferation of imperialistic statist regimes flowing out of Europe into the rest of the world that carried anthropocentric worldviews with them, there were many different groups of people that had place-based wisdom, which was regenerative and ethnoecologically grounded in the place where they lived, meaning that they had traditions and worldviews that saw the ecosystems that they lived within as a part of them, as teachers, as living beings worthy of respect and reverence. And that was part of their traditions that allowed them to keep those ecosystems thriving as well as their people thriving. Examples of this can be found in the Aborigines of Australia, in the people of the Amazon, the terra preta builders, and all the way up to my ancestors in what is modern day Scotland and Ireland, where the Gaelic people and the Druids, they had a written law, the Brehon Law, that recognized trees as living beings, as nobles, and respected the ecology of the forest, allowing for the ancient oak forest to remain there to feed the people until the Romans came in a similar story to here in Turtle Island. I wove a couple threads of this kind of information through my book in the context of what I described as recipes for food for the soul and acknowledging and recognizing ecologically grounded traditions of cultures far and wide. Now, a couple examples you can find in the Regenerating Communities chapter, where I talked about voluntarism, Brehons, and the prophecy of the seventh fire. And then additionally, in the chapter where I share regenerative poems and short stories, is where I talked about the Edo period in Japan, both with my recipe on miso paste and in the chapter on regenerative poems and short stories, where I shared my perspectives about the art of kintsugi, or healing broken ceramic with gold lacquer to make it more beautiful than it was before. So I'll read this paragraph from the beginning of Scars of the Heart as Maps for the Soul. While it is true that many of our communities, as well as much of our dominant Western culture and broader societal infrastructure is broken, that does not mean we should give up or lose hope. We can find wisdom and paths to healing through philosophies such as the Japanese art of kintsugi. The art of kintsugi involves restoring broken ceramics by fusing the broken pieces back together with gold. It is an art form built on the idea that in embracing flaws and imperfections, you can create an even stronger, more beautiful piece of art. Every break is unique, and instead of repairing an item like new, the 400-year-old technique actually highlights the scars as part of the design. Using this as a metaphor for healing ourselves, our communities, and our society as a whole teaches us the important lesson. Sometimes in the process of repairing things that have broken, we actually create something more unique, beautiful, and resilient in the process. When we reconnect with the living planet in a reciprocal relationship, as our ancient ancestors did, nurturing the land and our bodies through cultivating food and medicine crops in a way that gives back, we are mending the broken relationship that humanity has with the living world that sustains us. We are healing the fragmentation of our species and how we connect with Mother Earth. And doing so in a way that, if done with love and care, can create a connection that is even more beautiful than it was before. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share with you guys an illustrative slideshow so that you can have more information than just watching me speak. I'm going to talk about the concept of creating a biocultural refugia, break it down into the etymology of the term, and then talk about how we can install that in our daily lives. Okay, so first of all, what is a refugium? Refugia, the plural form of refugium, is a concept discussed by E.C. Pilu in After the Ice Age, The Return of Life to Glaciated North America, among other places. In a nutshell, refugia, also called fuges, are small pockets of life that were sheltered from broader happenings on the Earth that destroyed and crippled habitats in many other places as well. According to Pilu's work, refugia were small pockets of life that were, for various reasons, spared from the worst of the effects of the last ice age, when the rest of these lands were barren and covered in ice. These isolated pockets survived in a sheltered spot, a microclimate, a high point, and so on. When the glaciers receded and left a bare landscape devoid of topsoil or life, it was these refugia that allowed life to spread outward again, repopulating areas in North America covered by glaciers. Of course, refugia aren't limited to North America. They are a worldwide phenomenon, and even our human ancestors at various points in history have used them to survive challenging environmental conditions. In the Anthropocene, that is, the time of human-dominated ecological change we are all currently experiencing, things are a bit different than in glacial North America. But things are not as different as you might think. For one, the loss of biodiversity and essentially an inhospitable landscape can pretty much sum up the 40 million acres of lawns currently in cultivation in the U.S. alone. The 914,527,657 acres of conventional farmland in the U.S., and the amount of concrete and houses taking up land. We also have wild areas that have been subject to pillaging and resource mining, and these areas are a lot less diverse than they once were. The spaces that aren't actively being pillaged likely are recovering from pillaging, at least around where I am, some areas are. Some are subject to other duress, and the few spaces that are supposedly safe and protected are under the constant threat from new government profiteering operations, legislation that allows or encourages logging and mining, etc. And so we have a situation where biological life generally has a lot less space to grow and thrive unhindered. Given this, I believe that the concept of refugia is a useful one to consider, and even enact, given the circumstances we have going on right now. A lot of us don't have control over what's happening in the land around us, but we can help to cultivate small spaces of intense biodiversity, spaces that can preserve important plant and tree species, and then we can put more of the building blocks back into nature's hands for the long-term healing of our lands. I was introduced to the concept of refugia, or refugium, by an excellent book by Dana O'Driscoll called Land Healing: Physical, Metaphysical, and Ritual Approaches for Healing the Earth. In her book, she talks about the goals of creating refugia by saying, we can cultivate refugia in cultivated, human-dominated spaces like lawns, etc., or we can create them in wild spaces, forests, wild fields, that we know will be safe for some time. In permaculture and organic gardening communities, people have long been creating spaces that are intensely planted, that may be perennial or annual in nature, and they might be doing them with different goals. Most in permaculture practice, the goals are intensely focused on the site, the goal of bringing degraded piece of land back into healthy production, with a range of yields, some of which are beneficial to humans and some of which are beneficial to other life. In other words, permaculture designers often use a kind of sanctuary model. For organic farmers, they may have many of the same goals, but different or more annual goals and more annual means. Both may be interested in some kind of economic benefits as well. Working to actively create refugia can add and complement these existing goals in the sense that we are creating a protected place, physically and energetically, that is richly biodiverse, with the idea that biodiversity can spread if the opportunity, or if we spread it ourselves. I would like to suggest that each of us, as we are able, create biologically diverse refugia, small spaces, rich in diversity and life, that can help our lands weather the storm, and a place where we can grow seeds, nuts, roots, and scatter them far and wide. In essence, a fountain of life that can spread outwardly. Or if we are already cultivating biologically diverse gardens, homesteads, and sacred gardens, and the like, we can add the goal of becoming refugia to our plans, and plant accordingly. I would like to suggest that we can not only do this as a physical act, but also as a sacred and spiritual practice. I've been applying these concepts within our young urban food forest and garden over the last few years, growing things that are both endangered within our local bioregion, such as wild pawpaw trees, wild ginseng, wild Canadian ginger, black and blue cahoosh, ramps, and other plants, and also growing plants that are highly practical within the context of permaculture design or regenerative agroforestry and are endangered in other habitats, such as the wild apple trees of Kazakhstan. I've used this central refugium that I've created in my space as a nexus point where I can scale up seed production of highly practical, medicinal, and endangered plant and tree species, and then I can help them spread out into the local ecosystems here, which are highly degraded. So what I do is I'll take my pawpaw seeds and I'll take my wild apple trees and I'll bring them out and I'll do some guerrilla gardening in the local parks here. I'll put some seed balls together with compost and clay, and plant the pawpaw trees in ideal habitat, plant the complementary rhizomatous plant seeds around it like wild ramps and wild leeks and ginseng and wild ginger, and then encourage them to thrive over the coming seasons so they can get reestablished here. And at the same time, while I'm planting these wild refugium within existing forest habitats that are partially degraded, I'm also observing what plant species already grow there, which are highly useful for medicine or food, such as shagbark hickory or tulip trees, which have been highly degraded in this landscape as well. I'm saving seeds from those trees, and I'm planting them also adjacent to these endangered plants within that forest habitat, so that in the future, higher populations of these ideal food and medicine species can grow together. Now that's an example of applying a cultural wisdom to a biological refugia, because I'm doing wild tending practices like the indigenous people have done on North America or Turtle Island for thousands of years. So cultural refugia is what I'll get to in a moment. So what are cultural refugium? Mediums through which endangered ecological cultural seeds of wisdom can be preserved and propagated. For the purposes of this talk, I'll be focusing on cultural facets that have ethnoecological characteristics and/or cultural facets that embody and promote ecological literacy and regenerative relationships with the earth. There are many cultural facets that do not fall within that realm of focus, and others may wish to preserve those unique cultural expressions and create cultural refugia of different forms for that purpose. The fact that I will not be discussing them here does not mean I wish to diminish their worth or value. It is simply beyond the scope of this discussion. The following are some examples of cultural refugia mediums that I've encountered, not an exhaustive list. Number 1. Art. Physical art forms such as carvings, sculptures, paintings, pottery, earthworks, standing stones, and basket weaving. Non-physical art, such as music, poetry, and non-written spoken languages. For some examples of non-physical cultural refugia that preserve and propagate ancestral wisdom, look no further than some of the presenters that are presenting at this very conference that are sharing ancestral wisdom infused into music. Check out Sean Stanton's Seventh Fire Band. Check out Parker Raymond Webb's Fungi Flows. And check out William Padilla Brown's It's Cosmic. All of them have some awesome stuff to offer as far as connecting with our ancestral wisdom and expressing it in a non-physical cultural medium. I also suggest checking out a couple other artists that embody those things, such as Grant Elman and his band Presence, Alex Mishka Frith and his band Frischka, Ben Stanford's Dub FX, and Nick Mulvey. I'll put links to all those in my Substack article linked to this. 2. Traditions, stories, worldviews, and spiritual practices. Traditions are voluntarily agreed upon consensus-based laws that relate to honoring the cycles of nature, giving thanks for the gifts that each season provides, or each tree or plant offers, and culinary traditions that are specific to each celebration, ritual, or prayer. An example would be the Brehon laws that acknowledge non-human beings such as bees, trees, mountain springs, rivers, and cats as having innate rights in Irish culture in ancient days. Stories as a means of relaying ethnoecological values through emotionally evocative, written or orally shared depictions of characters interacting that highlight the importance of ethics based on ecological literacy and moral integrity. An example would be the creation story of Sky Woman Falling, or the cautionary tale of the Wendigo, as it is shared by Robin Wall Kimmerer in her book Braiding Sweetgrass. Worldviews that are animistic and based in humility, rather than arrogance and anthropocentrism, such as the many cultures that see trees, rivers, lakes, mountains, and all the other parts of our natural world and the beings we share it with as alive, imbued with a spirit, and deserving of our respect and reverence. In many ways, permaculture design is itself a form of cultural refugium, in that much of the methodology and the perspectives and the ethics of permaculture design are derived from ancient indigenous ethnoecological worldviews. Now, while it is true that many people have become aware of these cultures and these viewpoints through permaculture, I also feel that it's important for us to honor those ancient traditions that became part of permaculture practice as being whole and complete unto themselves, and not just taking on an exploitative relationship with those traditions where we don't honor the cultures as having their own worthwhile, complete worldviews that are worth looking at aside from permaculture. For instance, the permaculture ethical compass of earth care, people care, future care can also be found in the ancient traditions such as the seventh generation principle of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, people that lived in the land where I now live in the eastern woodlands of Turtle Island for thousands of years, and also in the ancient concepts practiced by the Druidic knowledge, in which they placed an emphasis on seeing nature as sacred, practicing generosity, and having integrity, looking to the future and ensuring our community will thrive, as well as our community of non-human beings around us. And last but not least, spiritual practices surrounding the above listed things, such as prayers, blessings for the land, seeds, water, air, fire, stone, trees, and the stars, meditative practices involving grounding within a forest or garden with the intent to connect with non-human intelligence that dwells there, and spiritual maxims that encourage us to use our unique gifts in service of life and remind us we are a young species and the needs of the ecosystem around us are of paramount importance. Examples include the covenant of the way of the honorable harvest, as expressed by Robin Wall Kimmerer in Braiding Sweetgrass, or the Druidic concepts of seeing all aspects of nature as sacred and non-human beings as teachers imbued with a spirit, or the seventh generation principle previously mentioned of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, where they encouraged each of their community members to consider how their actions would impact the next 7 generations. And the last form of cultural refugia that I'll discuss here is number 3, linguistic expression, written and spoken language forms, such as scrolls, tablets, carved stones, and books. Some books that come to mind, which I consider to be embodiments of cultural refugia, include, but are not limited to, Braiding Sweetgrass, To Speak for the Trees, Sand Talk, Dark Emu, The Largest Estate on Earth, The Living Wisdom of Trees, The Spirit of Trees, Tending the Wild, and Land Healing. Additionally, I would also say that The Unlikely Peace at Kudlamik would also fall into that category. Other linguistic expressions of cultural refugia can come in the form of spoken languages that embody ecological literacy, humility, and compassion, such as the Ogham Tree alphabet of the ancient Gaelic and Druidic culture, or the Potawatomi language in the way that it does not have any word for it in referring to our non-human relations, but rather sees them as kin and refers to them as he or she, like family. Then there are other books that, while they may not focus solely on preserving the ethnoecological cultural essence of one place or people, they do weave threads together from multiple forms of place-based wisdom, and also offer ways to apply those ways of seeing and creating using modern tools and science. Some of the books I feel offer frameworks for the reader to receive the gifts of ancient ethnoecological wisdom and plant those seeds of wisdom within the fertile soils of modern science and tools include Radical Mycology, The Healing Trees, Trees of Power, Becoming a Good Relative, The Most Dangerous Superstition, The Voluntarist Handbook, Land Healing, Living Energies, A Magical Compendium of Eastern North American Trees, Beauty in Abundance, The Art of Fermentation, The Regenerative Landscaper, all of Matt Power's books, especially Regenerative Soil and The Permaculture Student 2. And I also attempted to offer that to the reader in my first book, Recipes for Reciprocity, and will be focusing on that more specifically in my next book. Now that we've explored both physical or biological refugium, as well as forms of cultural refugium, let's talk about merging physical refugium with cultural refugium. When we cross-pollinate and companion plant these two concepts to create a new whole, we can nest forms of cultural refugia within physical refugia, adding both synergy and increased resilience to both paths of preserving diversity. I've been working on a community food forest project recently and endeavoring to intentionally design gardens, tree guilds, and gathering creating spaces for humans that are specifically tailored to support, invigorate, encourage, and provide the ancient ethno-ecologically relevant plants for ecologically grounded cultural expressions, ceremonies, blessing rituals, art workshops, and unique culinary expressions. And I had thought that my approach might be novel. Well, it turns out many people have already thought this exact same thing, and there's a word for it: biocultural refugia. The term ethnoecological, as I use it in this presentation, refers to the study of how different groups of people living in different locations understand and interact with the ecosystems around them, especially when the way they interact is regenerative or sustainable. The term ethnogenesis, as I use it in this presentation, refers to efforts to create countercultures which are permanent. Ethnogenesis driven by an ethnoecological imperative of reciprocity is the process of creating an emergent regenerative culture. Active ethnogenesis is deliberate, direct planning and engineering of a separate identity. This is a controversial topic because of the difficulty involved in creating a new ethnic identity. However, it is clear that active ethnogenesis may augment passive ethnogenesis. Active ethnogenesis is usually inspired by emergent political issues. It's worth highlighting that in the way in which I'm using this term, ethnic we typically think of as racial or genetic differences in individuals, but in the context of ethnogenesis for culture, it does not have to be defined by a genetic difference or a national difference, but rather by a difference in culture and how one chooses to live and how one chooses to interact with their fellow beings and the nature around them. So this allows for the openness of people of vastly different genetic heritages to be part of a shared culture based on decisions they consciously make. I feel like it's important to emphasize that the way I'm using this term is intended in an inclusive manner and has nothing to do with genetic heritage or race, and rather has to do with the choices one makes as individuals, especially in this time when political happenings in like the United States are resulting in a lot of people shifting to isolationist views in relation to their views of so-called immigrants and other peoples. I want to make it clear that this is more about opening up the possibility of people from vastly different genetic lineages joining together with a shared purpose that aligns with a regenerative attitude towards the earth. What we tend to think of as cultures are often actually patterns of systemic refusal, which emerged in response to political conditions deemed unacceptable to some people within a given society. These people then separate themselves in some way from that society, becoming culturally distinct in the process. Ethnogenesis is sometimes described within the context of the emergence of a subculture or counterculture, which, if able to continue resisting what it was opposing, would become a different culture entirely. The emergence of new cultures through ethnogenesis is well documented and often stems from a flight from state power, a process which begins with a choice to differ from the majority of the existing group. When we collect, preserve, cultivate, and share heirloom seeds, while simultaneously feeding ourselves, growing medicine, providing habitat and nectar for pollinators, and building biomass for building soil, what we are really doing is engaging in a non-genetically, non-religious, non-nationalistically, and non-geographically defined form of ethnogenesis, creating an emergent culture that is primarily defined by its ethno-ecological attributes. In many ways, the permaculture movement and regenerative food movement can be seen as an expression of ethnogenesis, or the emergence of a counterculture or subculture. I explored this further in my essay titled Why Involuntary Governance Structures Are Not Compatible with the Permaculture Ethical Compass, which further serves to illuminate how the existing status structures are antithetical to the permaculture compass and many of the ethical worldviews of the ancient indigenous peoples which permaculture is based upon. When we recognize, give our attention and reverence to, and interact with species of trees and plants that bind our present with our ancestral cultural past, in a way that honors the diversity of our human family while also giving back to the earth, we begin to engage in ethnogenesis in a way that connects our hearts, minds, and conscious awareness to both the wisdom of our ancient indigenous ancestors and people from all over the planet that may look very different outwardly, yet at their core share the same innate God-given spark and ancient cultural connection to the living world. There are ancient prophecies that relate to this process of ethno-ecologically grounded ethnogenesis, such as the prophecy of the warriors of the rainbow, which is a prophecy that's shared in variations by several cultures, including the Cree, the Hopi, the Salish people, the Cherokee, and others. This is the prophecy of the rainbow warrior, as told by a Lakota elder named Standing Bear. Our ancient prophecies say a time will come when the blue sky and the waters turn black and green things turn brown and die. Animals and fish will disappear and the birds will drop from the sky. This devastation will come because of man's greed and disrespect for Mother Earth. Great leaders, warriors, and shamans of many nations will be born to be pathfinders. They will cleanse the earth for rebirth. Next will come the planters, sowing the seeds of truth, justice, and freedom. the storytellers, warriors, and planters will live in a way of the Great Spirit and teach ways to keep Mother Earth sacred forevermore. They will be called the Rainbow Warriors, for they will bring together the four races of man to live in peace, the four sacred directions, and the four races of man are symbolized by the magnificence and glory of the rainbow, the diversity of energy, and expresses itself in the wavelengths of color, the rainbow. As we seek to receive the ancient seeds of wisdom from our ancestors and plant them in the fertiles of modern regenerative knowledge, I feel that we can look to our tall-rooted elders, as our ancestors did, for guideposts on that path to engage in an intentional form of regenerative ethnogenesis. I touched on two such examples of species that help to define, enrich, and connect cultures from all over the world in my articles on both birch trees and pine trees on Substack. Widely present tree families such as birch and pine offer a sacred reminder of a time before arbitrary lines were drawn in the sand by statists for ego and greed. Back to an era when many of our ancient ancestors knew the birch trees and the pine trees and had a reciprocal relationship with them. Long before people were swearing allegiance to kings, queens, and flags, they were swearing allegiance to the living earth, recognizing our ancient kin, such as the Lady of the Woods or the birch tree, and the nobles of the global woodlands or the pines, and the many gifts they share with us. All throughout human history, statist empires and regimes have sought to steal the land from and impose their will upon people who had chosen to live in close connection to the land and the forest by assigning them with the dehumanizing, condescending, and derisive label of uncivilized or savage. As Dr. Lily June astutely points out, this was and is not only true of how the statists sought to annihilate, assimilate, and pillage the cultures and the lands of the diverse peoples of Turtle Island, it is also true of how they sought to, and continue to seek to, do the same to people who lived all over the world, who had a close relationship with the land and the forest. What I have found on my own path to excavate my ancestral indigenous roots and decolonize my own worldviews is that in many ways this process can present unique challenges for those of us with indigenous ancestors to Europe. In many cases, those with a European ancestry are looking at 1 to several millennia of colonialism and brainwashing to undo and peel away before you can get back to the indigenous roots of your people. The pop culture propaganda distorts your own self-image when we begin to look at how our European indigenous ancestors lived. For instance, many in modern times have been conditioned to see the ancient Druids and their Celtic predecessors, the Brehon or Brethahim judges, as savages. This is nothing more than the sad propaganda of a hollow, social, agricultural, and scientific involuntary governance statist regime, attempting to erase the cultural accomplishments and memory of those they sought to silence and dehumanize in the name of imperialistic conquest and greed. The Druidic wisdom keepers encapsulated their combined memory of medicines, conflicts, natural disasters, geology, meteorology, pathways to finding peaceful resolution, and stories that educate the listener about astronomy, mathematics, and ecology into rhymed verse, often recited as part of a song with harps or flutes. Those concentrated expressions of their culture were passed down to the time of the Celts and were written down in ogham on stone and wood to become the Brehon laws. They used verse, song, and stone to create cultural refugia. The first recordings of the Brehon laws were made around the year 700 BC. They were collected, not invented, by a great Brehon judge named Olam Folda, and inscribed into ogham in stone and on elongated wooden panels. These were said to be written forms of laws, ways of seeing, and knowledge, with much more ancient roots and deep history in that land, which was, up until then, passed down in the form of rhymes and verse, and in the form of music. The Roman Church began attempting to erase that cultural history in the year 438 AD, when monks were sent to gather all the Brehon laws recorded on wooden panels and stone and transcribe them, censoring that which did not align with the Christian views of the world and our place in it. The Roman statist interlopers gathered the sacred laws of the Brehon, and after transcribing them into what they described as a purified form, meaning censored, altered, and redacted, they destroyed all the original ogham writing they could get their hands on. This attempt to steamroll the old Druidic ways and distort Brehon law to serve as another tool for indoctrinating and assimilating the Celtic people failed, as much of the ogham which recorded the ancient knowledge was carved into large stones all over the land, hidden in corners, cliffs, and boulders. The ancient Gaelic knowledge keepers of the time, or the Brehon judges, saw what the Roman Christian Church was attempting to do, and so they made sure to infuse their wisdom into verse, wrapped in a thread of poetry, and taught these songs to the bards and townsfolk far and wide to preserve the essence of their culture. Again, they had the foresight to use verse, song, and stone to create cultural refugia. These are ideas that we can infuse into our garden designs so we can pass on important cultural essences to the future generations. This wise, covert approach to preserving their cultural wisdom persisted for well over a millennia until again it came under the direct threat from statist regimes that sought to erase the past and impose their degenerative, involuntary governance structures upon the Celtic tribes. That is why the statists of the British monarchy, Queen Elizabeth, ordered her thugs to hang the harpers wherever they are found and destroy their instruments. Harpers, however, were not the only Irish treated with such hostility. In an attempt to gain control of Ireland, laws were enacted by the British Crown making it illegal for the Irish to speak their language, own land, or become educated and marry. The penalty was death. This forbidding of the bards from reciting their verses in their native Gaelic tongue under penalty of death was similar to how the Canadian government would later force the First Nation children of Turtle Island into concentration camps, euphemistically called residential schools, cutting off their hair, forbidding them to speak their language, and thus attempting to sever the hereditary line of knowledge which was passed down in verbal stories in their own language. The truth is that like the indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands of Turtle Island, what is now called Canada, the Druidic way of seeing, living, and interacting with our fellow beings on this world, which was passed down to their Celtic descendants, represented a clear example of how people can live, prosper, and interact without the existence of a centralized state, or involuntary governance structure. Those people who were speaking the languages of those ancient ways of being, living in close connection with the land, and in a stateless society, were seen as a threat to the imperialistic statists, who were attempting to impose their degenerative and unnecessary systems of dominion on those two separate continents. Thankfully, the statist thugs and agents of involuntary governance structures failed to kill and silence all the storytellers, and this ancient wisdom offered by these windows into our shared history persists despite their despotic violence and vicious attempts. Thanks to the brave storytellers, rhymers, and covert harpists of the Highlands, we have glimpses of a trail map that is both ancient and socially advanced that can help us find signposts as we trailblaze a more regenerative, honest, equitable, compassionate, and hopeful future. I share this story about my Gaelic ancestors to illuminate the fact that statist regimes have sought to stamp out place-based wisdom all over the world, but we still have shards of that wisdom that we can put back together, and using perspectives such as the artist Kintsugi, we can merge those perspectives with modern regenerative knowledge and with the blessings of other cultural wisdom and find something even more beautiful and resilient for the future. We are now called to look within, to find these ancestral seeds, and then merge them with a handful of physical seeds outwardly, so that we can consciously initiate regenerative, ethnoecologically defined ethnogenesis through our actions in and on this beautiful earth, creating pockets of emergent place-based subculture all over the planet, and using our unique gifts to become the medicine that both the earth and our human family need so desperately. In an excellent book called The Unlikely Peace at Cuchamaquik, The Parallel Lives of People as Plants, Keeping the Seeds Alive, by Martin Purcell, he talks about this process of excavating ancestral seeds of knowledge and then applying them in our daily lives in the present so that we can create a sort of emergent subculture or engage in ethnogenesis. I'll share a quote from the book now that speaks to that, and then another one towards the end of this talk. The seeds that every citizen of Earth has somewhere tucked away inside themselves, or outside in their lives, or somewhere in the ground, or lurking around the family baggage, or hidden in their bodies, in dreams or inexplicable proclivities, but always somewhere they never look or know anything about. These seeds were the seeds of that very precious thing we all have that contains embryonic caches of possible understandings of how to live ritually and intactly with an indigenous mind. Seeds that have been bequeathed to us from all our more intactly earth-rooted ancestral origins from millennia previous. Getting back to this concept of biocultural refugia, I feel that through nurturing ethnoecological ancestral seeds, we can help create the antidote for multi-generational amnesia, anthropocentrism, apathy, and plant blindness. Through each of us excavating the ancient regenerative, ecologically literate, reciprocity-based, animistic, and reverent knowledge, worldviews, technologies, techniques, and traditions of our ancestral past, we essentially receive heirloom seeds of knowledge passed down to us by our ancestors. Through taking decisive action to germinate those seeds of knowledge within the substrate of a holistic vision for the future, with a foundation of modern regenerative soil science, a culturally enriched, globally collected information base, and modern mycological science, we can accept these gifts of place-based wisdom from our ancestors and give those regenerative seeds of knowledge newfound vigor, potential, anti-fragility, and purpose. When we create a refugium for biological species and nest within it the ancestral seeds of knowledge that we've received from studying those who have ethnoecologically defined worldviews, what we're really doing is engaging in creating a subculture. It's worth noting that within something such as the communal infrastructure of a food forest that is also designated as a refugium for species as well as cultures, cultural expressions can remain whole and intact unto themselves while also interacting with each other in a symbiotic way, offering a give and take, a synergy, where each learns from the other and we come to a new whole understanding by connecting. Therefore, cultural refugia become supported, potentiated, and enriched when they are nested within physical biological refugia. And the seeds of knowledge, traditions, and vision that cultural refugium architect seeks to preserve can only set down lasting multi-generational roots when those seeds are planted in the fertile hearts and minds of the young ones. Thus, the antidote for multi-generational amnesia, plant blindness, spiritual blindness, and anthropocentrism and apathy can be synthesized through creating cultural refugium, ancient cultural seeds germinated into living practices, traditions, and place-based wisdom that heal our relationship with the earth, nested within physical refugium, regenerative forest gardens where endangered ethnoecologically pertinent species are given a priority in the design. And they can provide heirloom cultural seeds. These heirloom cultural seeds of knowledge will be enriched by the stimulus of modern knowledge and capable of setting down root through educational programs that invite children to get involved, show them why those practices are important, and show them why they'll enhance their lives. Many of us with European ancestral heritage and or heritage linked to the places on Earth that are considered to be the cradles of civilization tend to think of the term indigenous as describing people of a specific culture and genetic background that are different from us based on where we currently live. In truth, indigeneity is a facet of each and every one of our ancestral bloodlines, regardless of skin color, genetic heritage, or nationality. In an essay called Reclaiming Our Indigenous European Roots in the Moon magazine by Lila June, Lila, having both European and Diné heritage, offers a unique perspective on this. She goes on to say, they estimate that 8 to 9 million European women were burned alive, drowned alive, dismembered, beaten, raped, or otherwise tortured as so-called witches. It is obvious to me now that these women were not witches. They were the medicine people of old Europe. They were the women who understood the herbal medicines, the ones who prayed with stones, the ones who passed on sacred chants, the ones who whispered to me at night. This all-out warfare on indigenous European women not only harmed them, but had a profound effect on the men who loved them, their husbands, sons, brothers. Nothing makes a man go mad like watching the woman in his family get burned alive. If the men respond to this hatred with hatred, the hatred is passed on, and who can blame them? While peace and love are the correct response to hatred, it is not easy response by any means. The indigenous cultures of Europe also sustained forced assimilation by the Roman Empire and other hegemonic forces. In fact, it was only a few decades ago that any Welsh child caught speaking Welsh in a school would have a block of wood tied to their neck. The words WN were inscribed, standing for Welsh not. This kind of public humiliation will sound very familiar to any Native Americans reading this who attended the U.S. government boarding schools or Canadian residential schools. The parallels between the genocide of indigenous Europeans and Native Americans are astounding. It boggles my mind that there are more people who don't see that we are the same people, who have undergone the same spiritual assault. The only difference between the red story and the white story is that we are in different stages of the process of spiritual warfare. Native Americans are only recently becoming something they are not. They are only recently starting to succumb to the temptations of drugs, alcohol, gambling, self-destruction, and the destruction of others. Just as some Native American people have been contorted and twisted by so many centuries of abuse, so too were the survivors of the European genocide. Both are completely forgivable in my eyes. Our task is to shake the amnesia, not to be ashamed of our Europeanness, but to reclaim our beautiful grandmothers, to reclaim our venerable grandfathers, to reclaim our lost languages, our lost ceremonies, our lost homelands, and become one with the great sacred motherland of Europe once again. European diaspora is spread all throughout the world, searching the planet for something that lives inside. I promise you, you will hear it when you climb the mountains of Switzerland, or Scotland, or Tuscany, or Hungary, or Portugal, of the sacred motherland of Europe. Just because bad things happened upon her bosom doesn't mean that she is bad. Martin Purcell continues to speak to the ubiquity of ancestral indigenous wisdom, regardless of our current nationality, in his book, The Unlikely Peace at Kutamakik, when he says, "Everything in nature ran according to its own nature. The running of the grass was in its growing, the running of the rivers their flowing. Granite bubbled up, cooled, compressed and crumbled. Birds lived, flew, sang and died. Everything did what it needed to, each simultaneously running its own race, each living according to its own nature together, never leaving any other part of the universe behind. The world's holy things raced constantly together, not to win anything over the next, but to keep the entire surging diverse motion of the living world from grinding to a halt, which is why there is no end to that race, no finish line. That would be oblivion to all. For the indigenous souls of all people who can still remember how to be real cultures, life is a race to be elegantly run, not a race to be competitively won. It cannot be won. It is the gift of the world's diverse motion that must be maintained, because human life has been given the gift of elegant motion. Whether we limp, roll, crawl, stroll, or fly, it is an obligation to engender that elegance of motion in our daily lives, in service of maintaining life, by moving and living as beautifully as we can. All else, to me, has the familiar taste of that domineering, warlike harshness that daily tries to cover its tracks in order to camouflage the deep ruts of some old, sick, grinding, ungainly need to flee away from the elegance of our original indigenous human souls. Our attempt to avariciously conquer or win a place where there are no problems, whether it be heaven or a new democracy, never mind if it is a spiritually ugly and immorally won and taken from someone else who is already there, has made a citifying world of people who, unconscious of it, have become our own ogreish problem to ourselves, our future, and the world. This is a problem that we cannot continue to attempt to competitively outrun by more and more effectively designed technological approaches to speed away from the past, for the specter of our own earth-wasting reality runs grinning competitively right alongside of us. By developing even more effective and entertaining methods of escape that only burn up the earth, the air, the animals, the plants, and the deeper substance of what it should mean to be human, by competing to get ahead, we have created a breakless competition that has outrun our innate beauty and marked out a very definite and imminent finish line. Living in and on a sphere, we cannot really outrun ourselves anyway. Therefore, I say, the entire devastating and hideous state of the world, and its constant wounding and wrecking of the wild, beautiful, natural, viable, and small, only to keep alive an untenable cultural precedence, is truly a spiritual sickness, one that will not be cured by the efficient use of the same thinking that maintains the sickness. Nor can this overly expensive, highly funded illness be symptomatically kept at bay any longer by more political, environmental, or social programs. We must, as individuals and communities, take the time necessary to learn how we might indigenously remember what a sane, original existence for a viable people might look like. To begin remembering our indigenous belonging on the earth, back to life, we must metabolize as individuals the grief of recognition of our lost directions, digest it into a valuable spiritual compost that allows us to learn to stay put without outrunning our strange past, and to get small, unarmed, brave, and beautiful. By trying to feed the holy in the nature with the fruit of the beauty from the tree of memory of our indigenous souls, grown in the composted failures of our past need to conquer, watered by the tears of our cultural grief, we might become ancestors worth descending from, and possibly grow a place of hope for a time beyond our own. The oversimplified and often totally inaccurate stories we are told about hunter-gatherer cultures portray this linear, almost classist dichotomy between pre-agricultural cultures and post-agricultural city cultures. We get the story portrayed to us that the story of progress or advancement of humans goes from us being drooling cavemen hunting herds of animals to grain-growing farmers practically overnight. But the reality is a lot more nuanced. In reality, for thousands of years prior to the existence of sedentary monoculture farming communities and involuntary government structures such as feudal dictatorships, monarchies, and nation-states, there were learned groups of human beings that had spent countless generations gathering place-based botanical, geological, mycological, hydrological, and spiritual wisdom, and they learned to apply that wisdom in the form of practical knowledge to access medicine, food, warmth, shelter, to navigate and find deeper meaning and spiritual purpose. These groups of humans living close to the land, developing ecological literacy with advanced botanical and mycological knowledge, were ubiquitous all over the earth for thousands of years. And those people, regardless of who you are and where you live, are your indigenous ancestors. Mounsey the Iceman, a 5,300-year-old mummy found in 1991, was carrying birch polypore fungus, and the herbal medicines of chamomile and yarrow have been found in 50,000-year-old teeth. Our most distant ancestors, that have often been portrayed as thuggish idiot cavemen, appear to have possessed more mycological and botanical knowledge than most people living in cities today. And for those of us that have ancestral roots from areas of the earth that have had imperialism and statism dominating the land for so long that there are scarcely any threads left in the written form to find any information on our indigenous ancestors, I would invite you to do the same thing that your ancient ancestors would have done to gather wisdom, which is learn from nature, apply biomimicry, go and sit with the land, connect with the trees, the waters, the mountains, sit and receive the intelligence from the earth, and begin to build your own traditions that are based on regenerative ethnoecological lenses of perception and connecting with the land where you live, giving back to the land. Another factor I think is extremely important to consider for those of us looking to connect with ancestral wisdom and ways of seeing, especially those who feel that their ancestral indigenous past has been completely erased from written history, is that each and every one of our ancestors wasn't just connecting spiritually with the living earth, they were also connecting biologically with the living earth. They were connecting with the trees, the fungi, the soil, the living waters, and all the information that they received from those beings through exosomic data, through microRNA that are being exuded by all the beings on Earth and received by their genetics, is also available to us now. So when you go out in the forest and you breathe that fresh forest air, when you touch the living soil, when you eat a fungi, you're receiving an upload to your memory, to your ancestral memory, the same kind of information that your ancestors could have received. Now for more on this, I highly suggest checking out William Padilla Brown's information on truffles and how he sees it as a keystone species, and Paul Stamets' information on psilocybin mushrooms. And when you think about that biological connection in the context of an old-growth forest, and how the trees there can live many hundreds to thousands of years, and they're connected underground through the mycorrhizal networks to countless other beings, what you're really talking about is a living library of knowledge. And those are the kind of living libraries that our ancestors would have tapped into biologically, energetically, and through biomimicry using their minds. So it serves to show how important it is to protect the last few old-growth forests, and how through going there and connecting as our ancestors would, we can tap into that same living library and begin to build or rebuild our traditions. Beyond just finding evidence of botanical and mycological knowledge that was possessed by our ancient ancestors, we can also see evidence of a more advanced form of ethnoecological ethnogenesis, when cultures began to intentionally modify their environment, and more particularly, they began to build the soil. Now that's what we can see when we look at evidence of soils such as the terra preta of the Amazon, and we can emulate that now, applying the ancient wisdom to our modern gardens, leaving a message for the future that shows that we had ecological understanding, and that we wanted to use our knowledge in the present so we could give to the future. In this time of extreme deforestation, globalization, sustainable development, and all-time low levels of ecological literacy, we can use a slight shift in perspective to reframe these realities as opportunities in disguise. Many of us live in areas that were once covered in biodiverse climax forest ecosystems only a couple of centuries ago, and now are mostly denuded of trees. Children born into these ecologically degraded landscapes can now often recognize more than 1,000 corporate logos, but can identify less than 10 plant species. One of the many degenerative inevitable results of this widespread ecological illiteracy, or plant blindness, leads to a sort of impoverishment of the soul. Plant blindness leads to spiritual blindness. It does not matter how many times someone is brought to a building or institution designated as a place to know connect with the divine. If one lives in a place that is completely ecologically degenerated with plant blindness, they can no longer walk in the cathedrals that the Creator designed called old-growth forests, and their ability to perceive, know the will, genius, and beauty of Creator's design is impaired, and their perception of beauty skewed. Being raised in a place devoid of the ancient, majestic-rooted beings that once dominated the landscape distorts people's baseline assumptions for what a forest is, and influences increasingly anthropocentric, materialistic, and degenerative life paths in humans that are raised there. Multi-generational amnesia results, and ecological illiteracy leads to poverty of the heart and imagination. But we can be the remedy for this in creating biocultural refugia. Studies related to paleoethnobotany have offered us insights into how ancient cultures define themselves in lasting ways through how they interacted with the ecosystems that supported them. The story of the essence of their cultures were written into the living soils, the depth and breadth which tells the tale of wise and humble people who lived for thousands of seasons cultivating and gathering food in a way that was reciprocal, regenerative, and aligned with ecological literacy. We can learn from this and apply this now, potentiated with new regenerative soil science, mycology, and other scientific understandings related to hydrological regenerative works that are presented by many of the speakers in this conference, which offers a legacy for the future that is written in the soil, that is spoken in the tree distribution, and that is offered in the regenerative seeds of cultural knowledge that we gift to future generations. Well, I hope that wasn't too nebulous, tangential, or abstract. I just feel that as seed savers and regenerative designers, we need to strive to not only save the biological seeds, but the cultural seeds that have a lot of regenerative potential for the future. Because in the past, what allowed the cultures that protected and nurtured the forest to thrive for millennia wasn't just their technology, but it was their cultural worldviews. It was their ethos that they had. And these are things that we can revive and breathe new life into today with reverence and in our own unique way. Some examples of how this can be applied in the garden in our everyday life would be if you're setting up your first garden, take time to develop some botanical literacy of the plants that naturally occur in your area, and get to know if there are any people that were indigenous to that area, get to know their knowledge of the plants, the medicine plants, and the food plants that grow there, and if you can connect with them, try to form a reciprocal relationship where you could have a space where those plants could grow, and if you have a community garden space, a space where perhaps a garden could be devoted to the traditional cultivation methods, and people can learn from each other and have a space to grow and share. And if you do have access to a community gardening space, think about practicing the 7th generation principle. Plant trees that won't only benefit you, but will also give to future generations that can live there for a very long time, provide lots of food, medicine, organic matter for the soil, and beauty for people to appreciate in the future. And if you have the space, try to create a space where you could have workshops where people could come in and do things like basket weaving and other traditional art forms from your area where regeneratively accessible resources can be used to create art that has a functional purpose. And if you happen to be stewarding a large tract of land that intersects with the ocean, you could think about inviting indigenous people to practice their regenerative clam gardens or oyster gardens there. These are things that invite cultural traditions to have a place to unfold, and they also give to the future because these tidal zone gardening habitats actually enrich biodiversity and they become a sort of multi-generational increase in food availability in that area. Another extremely important thing we can incorporate into every one of our gardens, whether they be our individual gardens or community garden spaces, is we can learn from the ancient soil builders that used to use the tool of fire to create biochar, and then we can add on our knowledge of regenerative soil science, create biologically diverse compost and foliar sprays such as actively aerated compost tea, apply that to the biochar, and then build permanently enriched soils. We can gift those to future generations, and they can become oases of beneficial soil life that spread outwardly as we work on our project spreading through the community. And then when we apply those other features along with regenerative hydrological features that help to slow the water and help it to permeate into the soil, what we're doing is we're adding a synergy to our projects where we're helping the sacred waters to nourish the other features of our design, and then we can give that to future generations in the enriched hydrology of the area. And if you're creating a biocultural refugium, whether it be in the context of your garden or a community gardening space, don't forget to invite your fungal relatives to be part of the mix. Stacking functions with mycological knowledge that we've gained in the last 100 years can add an amazing dimension of cultural enrichment, as well as the potential for producing huge amounts of food and medicine and building soil on site. You can use waste products from your local town, like coffee grounds, to grow oyster mushrooms. You can get wood chips often from arborists. You can inoculate them with different species, grow them underneath vegetable beds, use them underneath your tree plantings. There's so much potential to unlock when you tap into the mycological knowledge and then apply it in that context. I would suggest checking out Peter McCoy's book, Radical Mycology, for some ideas on decentralized applications in that context. And that brings me to another pathway I found to be really empowering when I'm stewarding ancestral knowledge as well as endangered plants or rare heirloom plants in a garden space. And that is to embrace the ancient worldview of the animistic worldview, to see plants as our relations, as our relatives, and to let go of the idea of this invasive plants idea. While there are plants that can outcompete some native plants, when we look at plants, if we see them through the lens as the gifts that they can offer, rather than seeing them in an adversarial way, we can see that there might be a potential for that plant that's now naturalized in an area to provide gifts to the project we're working on, while giving a space for the plants that we do want to grow there. One example would be the Phragmites. Here in Ontario, they're seen as invasives, and people go to war with them with chemicals and machines in a futile effort because their strong rhizomes come right back. But you can use the plant material, the stalks, grind it up instead of hay or straw to grow oyster mushrooms. So you can use them as a substrate for growing oyster mushrooms, turn those things into food, as long as you're getting them from a clean area, because they do hyperaccumulate specific toxins from polluted waterways. And you can also use the stalks that are dried as supports for your young plants, like you would bamboo. If you get the bottom like 3 feet of the really tall ones, you could use those like bamboo instead of importing bamboo from wherever they grow bamboo. And then additionally, the seed heads you can use in a similar way that cattails would have traditionally been used to make insulation for things like pillows. So there's 3 different ways that I found through seeing a plant as a relation and looking at it through the gift thinking lens. I can see how that plant could add beauty, diversity, and enrich the soil in my local projects rather than seeing it as the enemy. And once you've got the physical components of your biocultural refugium set up, don't forget to incorporate the non-physical components. Perhaps learn to refer to the plants, the fungi, the earth, the rocks, and the other attributes of your garden space in the language of your ancient ancestors, or in the language of the people who used to be indigenous to the place where you now live is. Learn to see those plants through the eyes of your ancestors, and develop some kind of practice that you can do, some kind of prayer or meditation that helps you connect to that space and helps you feel a place-based connection to the place that you're nourishing. Now, if you can't find a tradition that is rooted in your own ancestral past, then perhaps you could develop one of your own and engage in a sort of ethnogenesis of a ritual practice that helps you to connect with the land. Well, that's my presentation, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Matt, for inviting me to be part of this conference. And I hope this will inspire you guys to think about adding this as an additional dimension to your designs for gardens and for community projects in the future. For anyone interested in exploring the various forms of cultural refugia that I have in here, in culinary expressions and in traditions, you can get a 25% off physical copies of my book and 50% off digital copies by using the code OurFuture2025 on my website. I'll include the links below. I'm also going to make a standalone Substack post that has all the interesting books that I've mentioned listed. A few examples of cultural refugia that I include in my book come in the form of culinary expressions from cultures that offer us ecological wisdom we can apply in the present. Some of the cultures that I include recipes from include the Mayan people, the people of the Triple Alliance, the people of the eastern woodlands of Turtle Island, people from Laos, Ethiopia, Morocco, and Japan. Those forms of cultural refugia expressed in culinary expressions can be made into biocultural refugia through growing your own ingredients for the recipes in this book, saving seeds from them, and then sharing them in your local community, thereby increasing biodiversity while sharing cultural wisdom from the past. For those looking to expand your regenerative knowledge and apply it in your local community, I highly suggest checking out Matt Power's Advanced Permaculture Student Online course and Regenerative Entrepreneurs and Experts. As I was writing recipes for reciprocity, I found the knowledge shared in those courses and the networks that I connected with to be invaluable. Here's to a 2025 when we plant the seeds of ancestral knowledge within the fertile soils of the present to create a harvest of abundance, integrity, ecological literacy, and resilience for future generations.